Hello and welcome to yet another tutorial by Davies Media Design. My name is Michael Davies, and in today's tutorial I'll be showing you 10 important things you need to know when switching from Illustrator to Inkscape. This will by no means be covering all of the differences between these two programs, as there are many differences. However, these are what I think are the most important differences that you need to know as a beginner switching over from Illustrator to Inkscape. I'll be using Inkscape 1.0 as well as Illustrator CC 2020 for this tutorial. Both are the latest versions of their respective software. But of course, before I get into that, I want to direct you guys over to my website at daviesmediadesign.com. As always, I have tons of Inkscape, GIMP, and Darktable tutorials on here, as well as my GIMP book of layers and free software help articles, so definitely check that out. And you could get more with a premium membership to Davies Media Design, and I'll include a link to this as well as all the relevant links from this tutorial in the description of the video. So the first important difference I want to note when you're switching from Illustrator to Inkscape is that whenever you draw something on your canvas by default in Inkscape, it's actually going to obstruct the document boundary or the canvas boundary. So here I am inside of Inkscape, and you'll see I have my Inkscape set up to dark mode. I have a tutorial on how to set this up if you want to set it up for your Inkscape. But if I were to come over and grab something like the rectangle tool and draw a rectangle that covered up the entire size of my document, you'll see the rectangle will actually obstruct the boundaries of my document or of my canvas, and that can make it hard to tell if you're working inside of those boundaries. On the other hand, if I come over here to Illustrator, and let me just reset my colors here. If I were to grab the rectangle tool and do the same thing, so let's draw this over the entire size of the document here, the document boundary is still going to display. It will not be obstructed, and that's going to make it easy to tell if you're inside of these boundaries while you're working. Well, there is actually a quick fix or a quick adjustment inside of Inkscape for this. So let's come over to Inkscape and let's go to File, Document Properties, and down here in the bottom right corner you'll see it says border, and I'm going to check this option here, border on top of drawing, so that will fix our border being obstructed. I'm also going to uncheck the show border shadow there. And now if I exit out of here, we've got this set up to the way most of you who are switching over from Illustrator are used to. The second item I want to bring up is the difference between how the fill and stroke colors are changed between the two programs. So let's come back here to Illustrator. You guys are used to coming over here and clicking on this little icon or this little swatch, and the first swatch is for fill, the second is for stroke. And depending on which one you're clicked on, you can come over to the color picker here and change the color. It's a little hard to see the stroke right now. Let's increase the size of it. And if I were to come over here, I can also double click on the fill color, for example, choose a new color, and there it is. And of course you have your color guide, so you can choose from some swatches here. You can change your color palette, etc. On the other hand, if I come over to Inkscape, it's kind of hard to see where the fill and stroke colors are, but by default they're going to be down here in the lower left corner below what's called the color palette, as well as up top here in the top right. So this is how you can tell what fill or stroke color you have selected. You can also see the size of the stroke right here next to the stroke color. And if you want to change the color of your fill or of your stroke, you can come over here to the color palette and search through the colors you want to choose from. So let's go with this blue color at first. And so left clicking on the color will change the fill color. If I were to shift click on the color, that will change the stroke color. Some of you might be thinking that this color palette is going to restrict what colors you can use if you're used to being able to just freely use the color picker inside of Illustrator, for example. It's actually not the case. So here inside of Inkscape, I can actually go to Object, Fill and Stroke. And now here I have a variety of options I can choose from for changing the color of my fill or of my stroke. So here I'm working on the fill. I can come over here to the stroke color, and this is actually where I can also change the size of my stroke. So right now this is in millimeters, this document. I'm gonna go with pixels, and let's go with something like 40, hit the tab key. And also when it comes to the color palette, you can change the palette itself. So you can go with a totally different palette here if you wanted to, and this just provides you with some more options for the color you want to use. So let me come back here and go with the default palette, which is the Inkscape default. Important difference number 3 for this tutorial is going to be the differences between how shapes are drawn inside of the two programs. So for Illustrator, let's come over here and let's just use the select tool and backspace key to get rid of that shape. I'll come back to the rectangle tool. When I click and draw a rectangle, it's going to use whatever my fill and stroke colors are, as well as my current setup for my stroke. So each time that I draw a rectangle, you'll see it's just going to have those same settings. However, if I were to change the corners of this, for example, so change the styling up a bit, and let me just get rid of this color guide. If I were to draw another rectangle, it would not have those rounded corners again. So it will take on the fill and stroke color and the stroke size, but it's not going to have the rounded corners. On the other hand, if I go into Inkscape, and let me once again get rid of the shape, grab my rectangle tool. So just like in Illustrator, whatever my current fill and stroke colors are what is going to show up here with my rectangle tool. Same with the width of my stroke. So if I were to change this to 10, for example, and draw a shape, now it's 10, and each subsequent rectangle will have that same stroke width. However, if I were to round the corners of this rectangle here, and then I were to draw another rectangle, you'll see this will actually have the rounded corners as well. So that styling is going to transfer over from shape to shape, depending on whatever the style was of the last shape you drew. So if I were to change the style of this and draw another rectangle, now it has that style. Let me grab my select tool, select all these shapes, delete them. The reason this is important inside of Inkscape is that if I were to draw an ellipse shape or a circle shape here, circle shapes can actually have this feature where they look like either Pac-Man shapes or like pie charts. So if I were to draw this like so, open up this side of the circle and then try to draw another circle, you'll see that this is actually going to take on that same shape here. So that can be annoying if you're not used to it, but to reset the styling of your circle, you would come up here to what's called the Tool Controls bar. And for the circle, you have this little button here that allows you to reset the circle shape. And for the rectangle, if I were to draw a rectangle and not want it to have rounded corners anymore, I could come up top here and click to reset the corners to make them sharp again. So important thing number 4 that I want to mention for this tutorial is that there's actually no shape builder inside of Inkscape. So the shape builder tool in Illustrator is a super useful feature. It's probably the best feature in Illustrator in my opinion. Inkscape does not have this tool in particular, but it does have some features that are similar to the shape builder tool. So let's come over to Illustrator, and if I were to come over here and grab my selection tool and then shift click to select multiple shapes. Of course, I can come over and grab the shape builder tool and I can combine these two shapes very easily, or Control Z, Alt and click on a shape, and that will get rid of that shape there. So the shape builder tool is super useful. And also if I were to drag this shape over here and then shift click on two shapes, we have the Pathfinder feature here. And I can also perform some actions with these shapes using the Pathfinder menu. So hit Control Z. Inkscape is going to operate a little bit differently. So there isn't a shape builder tool inside of Inkscape. However, there is a workaround that allows you to perform some actions that work the same way a shape builder tool would work. However, there is not a formal shape builder tool, but you can select multiple shapes and come up here to the Path menu. And here you'll see a variety of actions here, and these actions in my opinion are like a combination between the Pathfinder tool and the shape builder tool. So for example, if I click intersection, now it's going to keep just the intersection between those two shapes there. So I'll hit Control Z. So the 5th important thing to know when switching from Illustrator to Inkscape is that the transform handles are going to act differently between the two programs when it comes to transforming shapes. So let's come back over here to Adobe Illustrator and click on one of these shapes with the selection tool. So you'll see here that there are no handles surrounding the border of this shape. However, if I were to hover my mouse cursor over any parts of this shape, the mouse cursor would change based on the area of the shape that I'm hovered over. So here I can change the width and the height. And if I'm a little bit outside the corner, I can rotate this. So the handles are pretty much hidden there, and you can also change the corners of this if you want to, as I showed you before. So now let's come over here to Inkscape. When I click on a shape with the select tool inside of Inkscape, the handles do appear here, so they're not quite as hidden as they are inside of Illustrator. And here we can do the same thing, so hovering over the corner, we can change the width and the height of this. If I hold Control, it creates a modifier key and maintains the same aspect ratio. Or I can scale this up or down and left to right. So there are no rotation handles by default, but if I click on this again, it actually does bring up rotation handles. And I can also skew this using the skew handle there. So I'll hit Control Z to back up. Finally, if you want to round the corners of this, you have to double click on here, and that's going to bring up this little handle that allows you to round the corners. And once again, you can change the width and height of this if you wanted to. But if you wanted to bring the handles back up for transforming this, come over here, grab your select tool, and now your shape is selected again. The next important thing to know when you're switching from Illustrator to Inkscape is that the eyedropper tool is not going to behave the same way inside of Inkscape as it would in Illustrator. So in other words, when you're working in Illustrator, the eyedropper tool is going to copy over the entire style of whatever you click on, but in Inkscape it's a little different. So let's come over to Illustrator to demonstrate, and I'm going to start with this shape that I already have selected. Let's say I add a gradient to this, and then I change the stroke of this to something like 15. And then I click on this shape here, grab my eyedropper tool, and click on this rectangle shape. You'll see it's going to copy over the style of this, so the stroke is the same size, the stroke color is the same, and the fill color is the same. Coming over to Inkscape, if I were to try the same thing, so let's decrease the size of this, and let's add a gradient as the fill. And let's change the gradient color there. And then let me grab my select tool. Let's come over to the stroke style here inside of fill and stroke. Change this to 15, so I've made the stroke larger on this one. If I were to come over here to my circle shape and I wanted to copy the styles from here, I wouldn't use the eyedropper tool because this is just going to change either the fill color if I left click or the stroke color if I shift click. And the color it's going to change that to depends on the color that I am hovered over. So if I'm hovered over the stroke color and I click, that's actually going to change the fill color here. So let me click on this again to change the fill color back to the gradient. If I were to shift click on that stroke color, it would change the stroke color on this shape. However, it would not change the stroke style, so the stroke did not become thicker on this shape. So once again, let me demonstrate. If I shift click on this dark blue color, now the stroke color of this shape is dark blue. And if I simply click on the stroke color here, so left click on this, now the fill color changes to that light blue. If I wanted to copy the style from one shape to another, what I'd have to do is grab my select tool, click on that shape, Control C to copy it, and then come over to this other shape, Control Shift V to paste. And that's going to copy the style and the colors from this shape. It doesn't always work perfectly, as you could see here, so the gradient didn't perfectly transfer over, but the stroke size did change here and the color changed. And actually, if you come over here to fill, you'll see the fill does have that same gradient, although it didn't display quite properly there. And this actually applies to text as well, so whenever you're working with text inside of Illustrator, let's come over here and just type a random, this is a test, Control A, let's go with something like 200 for the font size. If I were to type a new line of text here, this is a test, Control A, let's change this to century, go century bold, and maybe go 400 here, and change the color. So if I were to click on this text, grab my eyedropper tool and click on this line of text, it's going to take on the same styling here inside of Illustrator. However, in Inkscape, it's going to work the same way I demonstrated earlier. So if I click on here and type this is a test, Control A, let's change this to Myriad. Actually, let's just go with a different font. I don't think we have Myriad in here. So Maestral, increase the size, and then we grab the text tool and we'll type this is a test again. If I were to simply come over and grab the eyedropper tool and click on this, nothing's going to happen because the eyedropper tool is only copying the colors here. It's not actually copying the styling. If I come over here, Control C, click on this, Control Shift V, now it's going to copy both the styling and the color of our text. So the seventh important difference on this list is a quick one, and that has to do with whenever you are selecting something between the two programs. So if you're coming from Illustrator, you are used to the select tool or the selection tool working a certain way. So let's come over here to Illustrator, grab the selection tool. If I were to click and drag my mouse and just partially hover over a shape, it's going to still select that shape. And let's do that again, but with the text as well. So it selected the text there. This is actually not the same behavior inside of Inkscape. So let's come over to Inkscape, grab my select tool. If I click and drag this partially over an object, it's actually not going to select that object. You have to be totally hovered over the entire object for it to be selected. So this can come in handy when you are trying to select something, but you don't want to accidentally select the object next door. However, if you are coming over from Illustrator, it can be annoying because you're used to Illustrator just selecting things, even when those things are only partially selected. You can also select items simply by clicking on them. And if you wanted to select multiple items, you can shift click. So that allows you to easily select multiple items here. Item number 8 on my list is that locking objects inside of Inkscape is going to work differently than inside of Illustrator. So let's come back to Illustrator. If I were to click on an object and hit Control 2, that object now becomes locked. And if I wanted to unlock this object, I could go to Object, Unlock All, which is going to be Alt Control 2, or I could come over to the Layers panel, the Layers dialog here, and expand the layer. And here you'll see this little lock icon, so I can toggle that, and now this is unlocked. So this is going to work differently inside of Inkscape. So for example, let me click on this object here. If I were to hit Control 2, nothing's going to happen. It's not going to lock. I have to right click on here and go to Lock Selected Objects. And at first it's not going to appear locked, but if I try to drag this somewhere else, it's not going to actually move. And now those handles will disappear. And if I wanted to unlock this, I could go to Object, Unlock All, or if I hover my mouse over here, right click, I can go to Unlock Objects Below, and that will unlock that object. Also, I can come over here to Object, Objects, and here you'll see a list of all of the objects found in a layer, and the active object will always be highlighted in blue. So I can come over here and click the lock icon. Now this is locked, and if I come back over here and click to unlock it, now the object is unlocked. So item number 9 on this list on important things to note when you're switching from Illustrator to Inkscape is that Inkscape is a little bit quirky when it comes to exporting your documents, especially when it comes to exporting to a PNG file. For example, I have my composition here, and if I wanted to save this as an SVG file, I would go to File, Save, and SVG stands for Scalable Vector Graphic. It's going to be what Inkscape uses as its default file type, much like Adobe Illustrator's .ai file. Inkscape, composition, save it as the SVG file, and click Save. Now if I wanted to export this as a PNG and I went to File, Export PNG Image, it's not simply just going to bring up a dialog box that allows me to then choose the name of my file and then export it. It's actually going to bring up this little dialog here over on the right side of Inkscape. And by default, it's actually not going to export the entire document, so everything inside of the document boundaries. I have to come over here under Export Area and choose Page. Then if I wanted to change the file name and location, I would come over here and click Export As. So here I could change the name and the type I want to export this to. I can only choose PNG. So you would think once I hit save, it would now be exported, but there's actually one more step. You have to come over here and hit the export button, and now that will be exported. So the reason this is kind of confusing is that Inkscape by default is not going to export the entire document or the page. It usually goes with something like drawing or selection, as you saw when we first pulled up the export window. So you usually have to manually choose page and then go through with the exporting process. And I'll show you what happens if we go with drawing here, and let's export this as Inkscape composition drawing. So you can see what this looks like when we exported this as a page. It cut off based on the document boundaries. Now if we export this as a drawing, And of course, I do have to come here and hit export for this to actually export. Let's come back to the export as window and you'll see what happened. It exported everything that was inside of our composition regardless of whether or not it was inside or outside of the boundaries here. So that's what happens when you choose the drawing option. So keep that in mind when you're working in Inkscape. You're probably going to have to manually select page as the export area. So the last important thing to note, item number 10 on this list when you're switching from Illustrator to Inkscape, is that Inkscape actually does not export to JPEG files. And I know for some of you it's like, how does it not export to a JPEG file? It just doesn't. So what you have to do if you want to create a JPEG file from your Inkscape composition is use another program. So for example, I can use GIMP, which is a free photo editor. Once I have GIMP open, I can navigate to where my document is located. So here is that document we exported. So I can drag this PNG file here into GIMP. And I could have added a background behind this by drawing a rectangle behind it inside of Inkscape. But since we're already in GIMP, I'll just add a new layer, fill it with white and click OK and drag this below the Inkscape composition layer. And then I can go to File, Export As, and just make sure this ends in .jpeg. Hit export, and I've already saved this one, so I'll just hit replace. And we could choose our quality, hit export again, and there you can see now we have our JPEG. So to wrap all this up, Inkscape is a great vector graphics program, but it does have its quirks, and it helps to know the main differences between how Illustrator works and how Inkscape works. That way the transition for those of you switching from Illustrator is much easier. All right, so that's it for this tutorial. Hopefully you liked it. If you did, you could check out my YouTube channel at youtube.com/daviesmediadesign. Don't forget to subscribe and click the bell icon to be notified each time I have a brand new tutorial. You can also check out any of the links to my resources in the description of the video. But thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.